This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Today we bring a close to our series on the Council of 50. When we started this 2 weeks ago, I told all of you, dear listeners, that this is a remarkably important subject of Mormon history, and you'll need to remember what we discussed in this series for the rest of the podcast moving forward into the Bloody Brigham Young Utah years. Last episode, I took historian D. Michael Quinn to task because I felt like he was minimizing the Council of 50 by viewing its eventual result while de-emphasizing the intent of the council when it was organized. The intent of the Council of 50 is a subject we need to spend our time and focus on because our timeline is in early 1844 when it was organized, and the initial intent was all that mattered at this time. So far, we've covered how the council was organized, the reason for the council's organization, the earliest members, William Clayton and his recording duties that delivered to us the minutes of what took place in the Council of 50, and then what the eventual aspirations of the council sought to be. Our examination has been far from exhaustive, but parts 1 and 2 of this series serve as the introduction and primer we need just so that we can understand the gravity of the situation when we read the Council of 50 minutes in future episodes. With the Council of 50 officially formed, the chips were down, the board of play was set. Joseph Smith was running for president in a hotly contested election with territorial expansion and slavery as the primary issues dividing voters. Joseph was the leading Whig candidate, but Henry Clay was a worthy opponent with more name recognition on the national scale. James Polk was gaining a mass of support as the Democrat candidate by linking the issues of Oregon and Texas annexation as a lump sum issue. The Whigs wanted to continue to stick it to Great Britain by taking over Oregon, but they opposed the annexation of Texas as that would make it a slave territory, and they didn't want more slavery. The Democrats, however, regarded the annexation of Texas as the greatest and most efficient way to expand slave territories in America, and they wanted to take Texas from the Mexicans. So, how did Joseph Smith deal with these issues on the campaign trail? Well, his campaign platform vowed to abolish slavery by 1850, but he hoped to answer the plight of the Southern slave-owning Democrats by, quote, paying every man a reasonable price for his slaves out of the surplus revenue arising from the sale of public lands, end quote. Public lands, of course, seized from the Lamanites. The amount of capital that slave owners had in their slaves, that was an ungodly amount of money. So the only way to pay for all of these slaves was to essentially buy all of them as a government bailout by annexing Texas and selling the land to private land speculators or giving it to freed slaves. Of course, the slaves would be happy because they'd be free from bondage. The slave-owning Democrats would be happy because they would have the government stimulus to hire people instead of relying on servitude. And then, of course, the Northern Whigs would be happy because America would no longer be a slave-holding country, which was a rite of passage into the second half of the 19th century for Western cultures anyway. However, the platform that Joseph Smith proposed was innovative, and it incorporated elements both parties wanted and both parties didn't like. It was a compromise. Joseph was always a bit of a rogue when it came to the status quo of society, so he decided to run against the norm and form his own populist party, the People's Party of America, with the Council of 50, of course, as his personal campaign management team. Now, there were quite a few irons in the Mormon fire during this 1844 election. A few possible plans could be employed based on the outcome of the presidential election. Joe called the Council of 12 to meet in his office over the red brick store, where he appointed, quote, Brigham Young, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Pratt, Wilford Woodruff, John Taylor, George A. Smith, W. Richards, and 4 others being present for the purpose of selecting a company to explore Oregon and California and select a site for a new city for the Saints, end quote. Searching for a new Mormon settlement played into the available plans that the Mormon leadership had. The Mormons knew they needed a new place to settle because tensions with the Illinois neighbors surrounding Nauvoo were beginning to boil. Oregon, California, Texas, those are the best options, and they were largely lawless territories where a theocracy could be established. Texas especially, because it wasn't even a territory yet. Joseph also wanted 100,000 soldiers from Congress to go liberate these territories from their possessors, including from the Lamanites, of course. If all went according to plan, Joseph would be elected president and take his massive army of 100,000 soldiers through the continental United States and liberate every territory and area from the Lamanites, killing off any who opposed their new white overlords and forming alliances with those who rolled over and accepted this inevitability. If the plan worked, Joseph would gather all these people with his private army of 100,000 people, along with millions of freed slaves and Lamanites who formed the alliances, and march all the way back to Washington, D.C., thereby instating martial law in every settlement on the warpath's return. If Joseph, however, wasn't elected president, well, that didn't really matter because that was the plan and it was going to be executed regardless. Accordingly, in the March 21st, 1844 meeting of the Council of 50, the council approved the ordinance to Congress to make Joseph an official officer of the U.S. Army and grant him the 100,000 armed volunteers to, quote, protect Oregon and Texas from foreign invasion, end quote. And the media went crazy. From the Illinois Register, quote, it appears by the Nauvoo papers that the Mormon prophet is actually a candidate for the presidency. General Smith possesses no such fastidious delicacy. He comes right out in favor of a bank and a tariff, taking the true Whig ground, and ought to be regarded as the real Whig candidate for president until Mr. Clay can so far recover from his shuffling and dodging as to declare his sentiments like a man, end quote. And from the New York Daily Herald, quote, Joe Smith, silence. Defining his position, we have received a pamphlet from Joe Smith, silence, in which he defines his political position in this world and his spiritual position in that which is to come. He explains also the Constitution of the United States by commentaries from the Scriptures and performs a variety of feats in dialectics, which altogether surpass anything we have seen in the line at the North or South. Joe Smith, silence, is a candidate for the presidency, and no doubt will have the whole Mormon nation. Well, that's some capital to begin with, end quote. So now that the Council of 50 had approved this resolution for 100,000 volunteers and Joseph Smith was running for president, Orson Hyde took this petition to Congress for the 100,000 volunteers. And when Orson Hyde first presented this ordinance, the House nearly laughed him off of the floor, but he was insistent. So Hyde reacted by sending the petition to local newspapers to spread the word and also called on the Mormon secret weapon, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. Now, Sidney Rigdon was fairly well known, and he was now on the edge of the limelight, being called as Joseph Smith's vice presidential candidate. So with the prospect of becoming vice president of the United States, the voices in the darker regions of Rigdon's mind seemed to recede, and the old king of oration returned. Rigdon made the trip to Congress. Along the way, he made a campaign of electioneering for Joseph Smith and preaching to constituents about the 100,000 armed volunteers and how they would prove to be the salvation of this broken nation that's wrapped in turmoil. He gathered signed petitions and told people to write their congressmen, which they did. So when Sidney Rigdon finally arrived at Congress to argue for the ordinance allowing 100,000 volunteers to liberate the western portion of the country and secure its liberty, he also arrived with dozens of petitions signed by thousands of voters. He argued passionately for 3 hours before the House, one of the finest moments of his career to this point. He told Congress how they would be complete fools to let the British conquer Texas and Oregon, to turn the Lamanites against the Americans, and allow a complete overthrow of the government. Little did they know that Rigdon and Joseph Smith's plans were not so different. Now, with amass populist support and letters filling the inboxes of congressmen, the House passed the ordinance granting Joseph Smith a legitimate position as a lieutenant general of the United States Army, along with 100,000 soldiers and immunity from opposition or molestation. So John Tyler, the pseudo-Whig president in 1844 who was up for re-election, knew that this was what the Whigs wanted and that they would do anything to stick it to the Democrats the way that his predecessor, William Henry Harrison, did before he died in office. President Tyler voiced his support for the ordinance, and the Senate voted with the president, big surprise, and the ordinance was signed into law. This was the first domino to fall. Joseph now had more power than General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. This ordinance passing was the most divisive issue of American politics up to this point, far more so than the Indian Removal Act 14 years prior. The southern states saw this as a power grab by the Whigs to regain popularity and social standing. The thought that an abolitionist who was running for president now had his own private army outside the control of the current president, the commander-in-chief, what might this Whig candidate do? How could the South and their society, slaveholding society, continue to remain safe in a country run by their political adversaries who wished an end to Southern society as they knew it? This only fueled tensions moving into the election of 1844. Back in Nauvoo, internal conflicts among the leadership grew to a fever pitch. William Law was removed from the first presidency of the church and excommunicated. The Higbee brothers, who had long suspected Joseph of killing their father, they were also excommunicated. The Fosters had been getting the short end of the stick for years, and they got excommunicated. Charles Ivans was caught up among a litany of all of these excommunications. And all of these excommunicated apostates joined together and published the Nauvoo Expositor on June 7, 1844. The Nauvoo Expositor was viewed as blasphemous, slanderous, and, more importantly, molesting an officer of the United States military who had immunity from such accusations. The Council of 50 met to determine how to deal with the Nauvoo Expositor. Quote, "These with other matters of minor importance served to arouse the public feeling, and the apostates, continually fanning the flame, spread the excitement far and near. On the 10th of June, the City Council passed a resolution declaring the press from whence issued the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance and ordered the same abated. The mayor, President Smith, was ordered to destroy the press and pie the type forthwith. He gave orders to the marshal, who, assisted by the police, obeyed the order, and the same evening by breaking the press and pieing the type in the streets." End quote. The Council of 50, also determined to punish the publishers under the new provisions created with the ordinance passed by the federal government. Accordingly, the Nauvoo Expositor Press was burned to the ground, while the city marshal took William and Wilson Law, Chauncey and Francis Higbee, Charles Ivans, Robert and Charles Foster, Joseph H. Jackson, and Sylvester Emmons into custody, where they were held in the Nauvoo Municipal Jail until the court could determine what to do with them, which we'll get to that in just a minute. So Joseph decided to make Nauvoo the headquarters of his military campaign to the western states with his 100,000 soldiers. Nauvoo began to be flooded with thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers moving themselves, and some of them even moving their families, to this kingdom on the Mississippi. By July of 1844, the population of Nauvoo had swollen to an excruciating 45,000 people. Sanitation was a massive problem. Feeding all of these people strained the city to the breaking point. The portion of the half-breed tract that Joseph had purchased back in 1839 began to fill with new towns almost overnight. Each of the cities were founded by members of the Council of 50 and officers in the newly expanded Nauvoo Legion, which was beginning to near 100,000 men strong. The cities that were founded, of course, bore Book of Mormon names: Enoch, Mosiah, Zarahemla, Morianton, so on and so forth. And of course, Book of Mormon and astrology played into the formation of these towns and of this army of God, which continued to bear the name of the Nauvoo Legion. This is from D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. Quote, "In the crowning event of his life, on 11th April 1844, the Theocratic Council of 50 anointed and ordained Joseph as prophet, priest, king, and ruler, PPKR, over Israel on earth. This was Thursday, Jupiter's Day. In addition, the 1844 Almanac made special note that on this particular Thursday, Saturn was in conjunction with the moon. Saturn ruled over Smith's zodiacal birth sign of Capricorn, and Jupiter ruled over the decan of Capricorn, in which Joseph was born. Intended for general readers, astrology handbooks did not recommend days for the coronation of monarchs, but 11th April 1844 was the moon's second day in Aquarius, when one should, quote, lead an army. Joseph Smith could not have chosen a more astrologically significant date in 1844 for his theocratic kingship." End quote. In fulfillment of every prophecy, the Nauvoo Legion was now set to be the one true army of God, headquartered at Nauvoo, prepared to cross the promised land and cleanse it of unbelievers and establish the kingdom of God on earth, even Zion. Now let's discuss the average new member of the Nauvoo Legion who joined because of the passage of this ordinance through the federal government. Now these were men who came from the lower castes of society. They may have owned property, maybe not. They likely had some vocational skills, but were far from educated. These prospective legionnaires read in the newspapers that they could join General Smith's militia to take the land west of the Mississippi, and upon successful completion of the campaign, each soldier gets 175 acres in the West to call their own. This was an appealing proposition, especially to descendants of Cain wanting to own some property once they were freed from slavery. Understandably, with these advertisements going out in newspapers across the country, the 100,000 initial volunteers for Joe's aggressively expanded Nauvoo Legion began to swell, first to 150,000, then to 200,000 as November 1844 election drew nearer. Nauvoo and the surrounding Mormon settlements were never known for massive exports or for industry. It was a city that was initially built on speculation and refugee settlement, but by November of 1844, it had become a sprawling metropolis war machine, consuming every city nearby. Factories were constructed in a matter of weeks, churning out wagons for the necessary supply chains. Market districts exploded all over these cities with goods and crops brought from all over the country, of course, trading at a premium. There was money to be made in Nauvoo in 1844. 3 new steamers were brought up to Nauvoo from New Orleans just to handle all of the ferrying logistics across the Mississippi, and those steamers ran 24 hours a day. Saloons and brothels cropped up everywhere throughout the Mormon Empire, all of them owned and controlled by members of the Council of 50. The Relief Society at this time, of course, was run by Emma as president, who was also crowned a prophetess, priestess, and queen by the Council of 50. The population of volunteer militiamen grew throughout the summer and fall of 1844. The Relief Society represented the only social structure that younger sex workers had at this time. According to Council of 50 decree, the Relief Society hierarchy was broken into 3 separate levels. Quote, "The Cyprian Saints. This body is solemnly organized in secret and select council and by its members. She takes the white veil, and her name and failing are stealthily promulgated among the trustworthy members of the church, at whose command she is, for licentious purposes, forever after. Many young and beautiful females have thus been ruined eternally." End quote. That was the first level. Now, if a woman gave in to her inevitable situation and just tried to be as good as possible at her job while a Cyprian saint, she could be inducted into the second level of the Relief Society hierarchy. Quote, "The Chambered Sisters of Charity. This order comprises that class of females who indulge their sensual propensities without restraint, whether married or single, by the express permission of the prophet. The Chambered Sisters of Charity are by no means niggardly of their favors to any of the faithful, provided the Holy Joe, silence, does not desire to monopolize any of them. They are at the service of each and all of the apostles, high priests, and elders of Israel." End quote. Understandably, the ranks of high priests and elders in Nauvoo had swollen in correlation with the massive increase in population of all of these soldiers coming in. Nauvoo was the largest city in Illinois and the 3rd largest in the country, and it was largely comprised of military personnel. Now, these Chambered Sisters of Charity were obviously pretty busy with all of the work, but not nearly as busy as the third degree, the highest level of Relief Society ascendancy. Quote, the consecratees of the cloister or cloistered saints. This degree is composed of females who, by an express grant and gift of God, through his holy prophet Joe, silence, are set apart and consecrated to the use and benefit of particular individuals as secret spiritual wives. They are accounted the special favorites of the heaven and the most honorable among the daughters of Jacob. This is the highest degree in the harem, and in the order of the prophet's licentious arrangements is held at the very acme of perfection, and it is indeed the ne plus ultra of depravity. End quote. So these cloistered sisters, these cloistered saints, the consecratees of the cloisters, these were the chosen sisters for various reasons. The youngest, the most beautiful, the most gentle, the virgins as special rewards for exemplary military behavior. And of course, Dr. Brink and Dr. Willard Richards were always on hand at these brothels for unwanted babies or to satisfy the carnal itch that ran rampant through the city. Nauvoo in 1844, in late 1844, with its 3-to-1 soldier-to-female ratio, was simply not a safe place for a woman of any age. Now, when these women weren't satisfying the needs of the soldiers, they were sewing uniforms. They were feeding tens of thousands of hungry stomachs with strained provisions that were spread very thin. Nauvoo became a city which never slept. Bored soldiers make for an unpleasant society. Prisoners and political dissidents were kept in labor camps surrounding the city to build wagons and guns and cannons, armor, and everything else that an army needs to make a crusade. Joseph decided to make an example of the 7 publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor who had tried to take him down in June of 1844. On special assignment, every single morning, Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell would open up the cells of the prisoners and hobble all 7 of these people together in chains. Then he would march them 3 miles through the streets of Nauvoo. Now, among these 7 prisoners, William Law suffered the greatest. One description of these daily marches paints a picture of William Law as gaunt and soulless. He was covered in mud from head to toe, and he gave off a stench that could kill swine. His hair was long, and it was ratty with his clothes that were so worn that they fell off him as he walked. But his physical appearance was nothing compared to his countenance. William Law, in these labor camps, was a broken man. Everything that he loved had been taken from him by the prophet, including Jane. This man looked like a hollow shell, like the man behind his empty gaze was no longer alive. So Porter Rockwell would march these prisoners through town every single day from their cells to their working post. They would work without breaks in the camps all day under the burning summer sun. Anytime children in town needed to kill their boredom, they were, of course, encouraged to go to the labor camps and practice throwing rocks. Then, at the end of every day, when most street business had concluded and people would just tarry about on the streets for community, these prisoners would be marched from the labor camps back to their cells, the 3 miles through the Nauvoo city streets, where, of course, people would call them heretic, apostate, enemy of the gospel. But such was the fate of any man who opposed the prophet and soon-to-be President Joseph Smith. The city of Nauvoo continued to grow during this time. You see, Nauvoo was perfectly positioned to be a forward operating camp of the coming Deseret military campaign across the country. Its location on the Mississippi bordering on the Lamanite territory, its proximity to Chicago by train or by the Illinois River, and just a quick jaunt down the Mississippi to hit St. Louis, that put Nauvoo in the best location to headquarter a massive war across the country. I mean, today it's the 9th largest city in Zion for all these reasons. The city's geographical benefits were a gift from the Almighty. Now, while all this was going on through the summer and fall of 1844, Joseph continued to campaign around the nation. His Council of 50 proved a formidable presidential campaign strategy council, with Brigham Young translating orders from Joseph Smith to logistical and practical realities, because that's what Brigham Young was best at. Joseph simply considered the Southern Democratic states lost, and therefore he wasted no time campaigning there. Instead, his focus remained on the progressive northern states with greater populations with more Whig voters. Joseph Smith was the anti-Andrew Jackson. Look, Jackson had campaigned on a populist platform to curry favor of the slaveholding Democrat states. He formed the Democrat Party. Joseph Smith took a page from Jackson's populist playbook, but did so by currying favor with everything that Jackson opposed. But just like Jackson, Joseph wasn't without his opponents, chief of which was Thomas Coke Sharp, the publisher of the Warsaw Signal. Now, we haven't read from the Warsaw Signal for a long time because it ceased publication in autumn of 1842 with this article. Quote, October 1st, 1842, Warsaw Signal obituary. It becomes our solemn duty to notice the demise of the Warsaw Signal with this number. It ceases to exist. End quote. With the Warsaw Signal on hiatus, Thomas Sharp didn't go anywhere. He was a guy that we talked about way back on episode 77. This guy was the editor of the Warsaw Signal, which ran a column about Mormonism with nearly every publication. He was very antagonistic of the church. He was also one of the founders of the anti-Mormon political party. Thomas Sharp was so caustic towards the Mormons that Joseph's younger brother, Crazy Willie Smith, responded to Warsaw Signal articles in his own publication, The Wasp, by calling Thomas Tom Ass Sharp. He was clever. So Thomas Sharp and his fellow citizens in nearby Warsaw, Illinois, which is about 20 miles south of Nauvoo, they were infuriated by the growing political war machine in Nauvoo. These citizens and Thomas Sharp took their First Amendment's rights seriously, and they restarted the Warsaw Signal with a brief explanation. Quote, Wednesday, February 14th, 1844, to the reader. In resuming our editorial duties, we feel it incumbent upon us to apprise our readers of the reasons which have propelled us to our present undertaking. Never, since the formation of our government, did it ever behoove any class of people to stand more firmly together for the protection of each other and each other's rights than the old citizens of this community are called upon to do in this present crisis. In our midst is a dangerous combination, bound together by the power of superstition, the strongest band that ever united the minds of men, led on by one man, and that man a dangerous and aspiring knave, possessing a capacity for secrecy which enables it to commit any atrocity without fear of detection. To such a combination, the citizens of this county are called up to unite and oppose themselves. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Shall we lie supinely on our backs until our enemy shall have bound us hand and foot? Shall we say Godspeed to the tyrant while he is riveting our chains? Knowing as you must, Joe, silence, the relation in which your black-hearted crimes and heaven-daring blasphemies place you before God, we charge you that it is now high time that you should begin to repent in order to avert his impending vengeance. You are now near 40 years of age, and it will require all the remaining years of your life of 80 to place you in the same moral position you occupied at the outset of your desperate career. You know, too, the position you occupy before your fellow men. You know that you are despised and hated and loathed by 19/20ths of all who have ever heard of your name and deeds, and all the appeals that you and your understrappers can make to the sympathies of your fellow citizens between this and the day in which you shall shake off this mortal coil will not change your position before them. And more, you cannot expect it to continue much longer in your courses of infamy and crime. Depend upon it, the day of retribution cannot be far distant, for at least some of your misdeeds. If the vengeance of the law shall overtake you and stretch you up as quick as lightning to the gallows and thus end your career, rest assured that individual vengeance will. Do you think that of all men, women, and children you have so foully wronged that no one will be so bold as to avenge their own wrongs? Be a prophet nor the son of a prophet, yet we tell you that your career of infamy cannot continue but a little longer. Your days are numbered. The handwriting is upon the wall. End quote. Was the Warsaw Signal blowing things out of proportion, or were they speaking truths that only they were privy to as neighbors of Nauvoo? The rest of the outside world operated under the assumption that the church was good, the people were kind, the prophet may be a bit eccentric, but he's a popular guy who can get things done that needs to be done. But as tyranny grew, national outlets tended to downplay the reality of the Mormon Empire, and Thomas Sharp voiced his concerns in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, Why oppose the Mormons? The Alton Telegraph is making some rather complimentary remarks in relation to our paper, regrets the course which we pursue in relation to the Mormons, and expresses the opinion that it is the duty of the press to allay, as far as possible, the excitement against the people. Now, Mr. Telegraph, you know but little of the circumstances by which the people of this county are surrounded. You know nothing of the repeated insults and injuries received by our citizens from the heads of the Mormon Church. You know nothing of the manner in which the laws are trampled underfoot and evaded by the Mormons, and they screened from their just operations behind a set of sham city ordinances. You know nothing of the baits held out, wherewith the more gullible portion of Joe's followers are induced to take up their residence in Nauvoo, and then of the manner in which they are fleeced of their all and reduced to beggary. You know nothing of the iron rod by which Joseph controls his followers, with threats of violence quieting the discontented, and by every species of tyranny restraining the liberty of the tongue and person. We say, Mr. Telegraph, you can know nothing of these things, or you could not undertake to lecture us for endeavoring to expose such a gang of outlaws, blacklegs, and bloodsuckers. It is a fact that can be substantiated by the most unimpeachable testimony that the discontented spirits in Nauvoo dare not speak or write one word against the prophet without risking their lives. And even those who have left the church will hint of iniquities which they dare not proclaim. It can be proven that there are men in Nauvoo who have publicly said that should Joseph Smith command them to commit murder, they should do it without compunction, believing that the command of Smith is the will of heaven. End quote. The anti-Mormon political party, with Tom Ass Sharp at the head, met in spring of 1844, and they passed a resolution to attempt some kind of controlling mechanism on the propaganda that was coming from Nauvoo. They couldn't control it, but they were trying as much as they could. And this was published in the Warsaw Signal. Quote, Anti-Mormon meeting at Great Plains. On motion, it was, first, resolved that the citizens of Green Plains request the Central Committee to forward a certain extra Nauvoo neighbor published December 1843 to Governor Ford, informing him of our situation, and that we wish redress for our grievances. Second, resolved that the chairman of the secretary of this meeting forward said extra Nauvoo neighbor to the governor of Missouri with suitable comments on the same. Third, resolved that we request the authorities of the state of Missouri to make a demand for such individuals as have transgressed their laws and fled to our state, especially Joseph Smith, the false prophet. Silence. Fourth, resolved that any of our citizens seeing a suspicious character lurking around, that we find out if possible his business and give him our opinion of spies and bad characters, trying to root out the Mormons, obviously. Fifth, resolved that we use our utmost energy to ferret out all dishonest persons in our section of country, whether Mormons or not. Sixth, resolved that so far as we are concerned about Joseph and his legion and his threats, we ask him no favors. Signed, Levi Williams, chairman, and H.P. Crawford, secretary. End quote. This anti-Mormon resolution was passed, and editions of the Nauvoo Neighbor in question were sent to the governors of Missouri and of Illinois, but none of it mattered. Governor Reynolds of Missouri had repeatedly proven himself impotent of prosecuting Joseph Smith. Governor Thomas Ford was so deeply in the pockets of the Mormons that he wouldn't lift a finger to put down this perceived rebellion. That was understandable, though. Look, Governor Ford was dependent upon the Mormon vote to keep his seat. If he ever opposed them, it would be politically dangerous and likely life-threatening. Governor Ford saw what happened to Governor Lilburn Boggs, and Governor Ford was no idiot. His only solution was to call out the Illinois militia and arrest Joseph Smith, but then he'd be taken into the Nauvoo municipal system and he would be ruled an enemy to the cause and thereby liable to fines and imprisonment in labor camps. So with Congress passing Joseph's 100,000 soldier order into law, which included the anti-opposition and molestation provision, Thomas Sharp, after publishing these articles in the Warsaw Signal, became public enemy number one of the Mormons in Nauvoo, and he was forced into hiding. The Council of 50 met and deemed him and the Warsaw Signal a public nuisance, just like they did with the Nauvoo Expositor, and it wasn't long before Pistolpack and Porter tracked down Thomas Sharp, and he was arraigned in before the Nauvoo Municipal Tribunal for opposing or molesting Joseph Smith. The court determined that Thomas Sharp was guilty without allowing him to testify on his own behalf or even bring any character witnesses. Thomas Sharp was a high-profile target for the Mormon leadership to nail, and they finally got him. He was sent to the Nauvoo labor camps building armor, and then he disappears from the historical record after that. The Warsaw Signal ceased publication. Amidst this increased militarization of Nauvoo, Election Day finally came in November of 1844. This was Joseph Smith's biggest moment. Would he carry the day, or would it be his Democratic opponent, James K. Polk? The votes came in, and Joseph carried 18 states, making him the second Whig president ever elected. Many had speculated that the Whig Party was dying, but Joseph's populist candidacy and his decisive firebrand policies breathed new life into the Whig Party. The states who opposed him, understandably, were Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. All of the slave-holding states with the exception of Tennessee, because Andrew Jackson gave Joseph his vote of approval. Joseph Smith took 52.9% of the popular vote, which granted him 234 electoral votes. Joseph Smith was now President of the United States. From treasure digger and magus to religious leader to demagogue to President of the United States, Joseph Smith truly was the embodiment of so many things wrong in America and in our political system. President Smith's first 100 days as President of the United States incited chaos. His inauguration speech seemed like pandering to his sycophants because the southern states and Democrats across the country didn't believe that he'd actually be able to accomplish anything in his campaign platform. They didn't know what was really going on. The issues of Oregon and Texas were at the forefront of what he intended to accomplish with all possible prudence. Quote, Governor Houston of Texas says, "If you refuse to receive us into the United States, we must go to the British government for protection. This would certainly be bad policy for this nation. The British are throughout that whole country trying to bribe all they can, and the first thing they would do if they got possession would be to set the Negroes and the Indians to fight, and they would use us up. British officers are now running all over Texas to establish British influence in that country." End quote. How did President Smith solve this? Well, by annexing Texas before Britain had too great of a control over it, and then used Texas to fight off the British invasion. Quote, "It will be more honorable for us to receive Texas and set the Negroes free and use the Negroes and Indians against our foes. Don't let Texas go, lest our mothers and the daughters of the land should laugh us in the teeth." And he added, "I know much that I do not tell. I have had bribes offered me, but I have rejected them." End quote. Now, this certainly rallied up the populist support for his cause, right? The prophet was just a grassroots kind of guy, just like all of the people who voted for him. He went from rags to president. He was the quintessential American dreamer that proves every lowly voter that they too can acquire their greatest aspirations if they just keep chasing their dreams. Now, accordingly, with all of these things in mind, President Smith's first order upon taking office in January of 1845 was to sign Executive Order Number 45. Executive Order Number 45 came to be known as the Zion Act, and it had a few interlocking pieces that made it kind of a Rube Goldberg piece of legislation. So, the Zion Act first freed the slaves. Now, in order to free the slaves without leaving slaveholders high and dry, the second provision was made. The second provision annexed Texas and made it a territory of America, giving all of the land to the government, which it could give to the descendants of Cain and sell off to settlers in order to fund the slave buyback program within the first provision. The third provision annexed Oregon from the British Canadian government and forced out the British minister. In February of 1844, headlines read, quote, "Mr. Packingham is to be specially empowered to enter into negotiations at Washington," end quote. Soon they read, "Questions still loom over British ministers' whereabouts." So that was pretty important to annex Oregon. The fourth provision of the Zion Act annexed everything south of Oregon and northwest of Texas, all the way to the borders of Arkansas, Missouri, and the territory of Iowa, and designated it the territory of Deseret. The territory of Deseret covered from the northern border of Texas, west all the way to the coast, all the way north to Oregon. And then east of Oregon, the territory of Deseret extended along the Canadian border all the way through Iowa Territory to Lakes Superior and Michigan, and then just a small jaunt to cut out the borders of Arkansas and Missouri to finally terminate again at the northeastern corner of the Texas Territory. The territory of Deseret was massive, created in this fourth provision of the Zion Act. It was somewhere in the ballpark of 1.371 million square miles. For reference, Texas itself is 261,000 square miles. The fifth and final provision created by the Zion Act outlawed any tribal systems and exterminated all Lamanites from any American territories other than Texas. Now put a pin in that fifth provision because it was actually part of the larger plan that we're going to be discussing soon. The prophet's election to president was so divisive. The southern states were livid, and they felt that they had no other option. They could not continue their system of society with an abolitionist president. But it was kind of a mixed bag for them. Look, I mean, Southern Democrats wanted the annexation of Texas and Oregon, but the price to pay would mean giving up their slaves and their very way of life, even if that meant they were getting a government buyout. President Smith's platform of offering them land in repayment for their lost slave capital, that wasn't good enough for the South. His aggressive expansionism was viewed as great by the Southerners, but that was also a point in his platform that was looked down upon by the high-minded, educated New England Whig folk. So if Joseph Smith's election wasn't enough to cause it, the Zion Act of 1845 was the final straw which caused the Southern states to secede. It started with North Carolina in fulfillment of prophecy, and one by one, every state who opposed the prophet's election all voted to secede from the Union. The last vote was, curiously, Missouri, who probably had their own reasons for waiting until June 27, 1845 to sign their secession notice. No state in all of America at this time had more reason to hate their new president than Missouri, because he had tried to accomplish there in 1838 what he had finally accomplished by late 1844. But Smith's presidency was just beginning when the South seceded. And he chose a different approach to the presidency than every president before him. So instead of spending his life in the White House and, of course, doing White House duties and delegations and everything, President Smith instead structured his system of governance more similar to a Roman consulate. He sent Vice President Rigdon to the White House to handle the day-to-day duties of the office and to hold rallies. And, of course, with Rigdon's power of oratory, those were extremely helpful. All the while, President Smith chose to remain in Nauvoo as the headquarters for the coming Deseret War. I mean, and this is understandable. The best commanders-in-chief fight alongside their soldiers, and that's what General Smith intended to do. The Deseret War was the bloodiest and most confusing period of Zion history. It included 2 stationary fronts and 1 expanding front. The southern slave states drew a boundary along the Mason-Dixon line, and of course they included Missouri. This was the southeastern Confederate front of the Deseret War. The southwestern front was in the southern border of Texas with the Republic of Mexico. Joseph wanted to ensure the entire territory of Texas remained with the borders as they were drawn without Mexican invasion and, opposition to this annexation. The third and the expanding front of the Deseret War began over the edge of the Mississippi River west from Nauvoo. The Des Moines River, which separated what used to be Iowa Territory from the state of Missouri, is where the first battles broke out. And directly west from the Missouri River Territory would be where the real war began against the Lamanites, and the borders of Deseret expanded rapidly. But the thing is, as stated, Joseph had a plan with the Lamanites laying in wait. To organize the Deseret War boundaries and decide the initial strategy, a meeting of the Council of 50 was called. Brigham Young was the general who was tasked with waging war on the southeastern front by maintaining the state boundaries with the Confederacy and the Union as they stood upon the South's secession. Quote, Lucian Woodworth was sent out on a mission, including traveling to the Republic of Texas and negotiating with President Sam Houston regarding the possibilities of a settlement. Councilmember George Miller was also sent to the Wisconsin pineries to bring down Lyman Wight and to be back by the time Woodworth might return from Texas." End quote. Now, Lyman Wight was a lion of the Lord and an apt military commander. Upon Lucian Woodworth's return from meetings with Sam Houston in Texas, Lyman Wight was sent to be the general who would maintain the border between Texas and the Republic of Mexico. For that, Lyman Wight needed Sam Houston's help and compliance. President Smith annexing Texas and the remaining Mexico territory north and west of Texas, that was a declaration of war against Mexico. Lyman Wight was the only trusted Mormon general and member of the Council of 50 who had the acumen and fearlessness to be the warfront general there. And this is where President Smith's plans for the Lamanites came into play. The Council of 50 also sent, quote, James Emmett on a mission to the Lamanites to instruct them to unite together, end quote. To the Lamanites in this respect, which that meant to the Potawatomi Lamanites who were living in Iowa on reservations at the time. This used to be Iowa, but now is part of the territory of Deseret after the Zion Act was passed. So the thing is, President Smith had a 4-year plan to effect his military crusade. The Zion Act included the Lamanite extermination provision in order to make it more palatable to the Southern Democrats who wanted territorial expansion, but the real plan was a bit more insidious, and it required complete cooperation from the Lamanite tribes. It all started with the Potawatomis. Back in July of 1843, then Prophet Joseph had met with some Potawatomi chiefs about their plight. He implanted an idea in their minds at that time, and they were receptive to the idea. From the history of the church, quote, "We have talked with the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit has talked with us. We have asked the Great Spirit to save us and let us live, and the Great Spirit told us that he had raised up a great prophet, chief, and friend who would do us great good and tell us what to do. We have now come a great way to see you and hear your words, and to have you tell us what to do." Joseph's response is as follows. "The Great Spirit will soon begin to talk with you and your children. I now want you to begin to pray to the Great Spirit. I want you to make peace with one another, and do not kill any more Indians. It is not good. Do not kill white men. It is not good. It will not be long before the Great Spirit will bless you." End quote. Those Potawatomi chiefs took Prophet Smith's words to heart, and now the time had come for the Great Spirit to bless them. Through his emissary, James Emmett, President Smith formed an alliance with the Potawatomi Lamanites. All they had to do was move to Texas and ally with every Lamanite tribe on their journey south to Texas. The purpose of this was to consolidate all of the Lamanites in Texas, where hundreds of thousands of freed descendants of Cain were about to begin making their new home. Should the border with Texas and Mexico be maintained successfully by General Lyman Wight, Texas was set up to be the staging ground for the final phase of President Smith's military campaign, which would come in 4 years' time. What was also going to happen in 4 years' time? Smith's re-election campaign. You see, President Smith never planned on getting re-elected once he took office. He simply never planned on stepping down. The Northern Americans would elect a new president in 1848 as per their constitution, but Joseph had no intention of stepping aside, and he knew that this action would result in conflict. His 4-year plan was to create this staging ground in Texas for the final military push, all the way to Washington, D.C. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. The Mormon war machine, Talos, they needed Lamanites to confederate together in order to form a more perfect insurrection army. The Potawatomi tribe was the most receptive to the Mormon alliance, and that presented the best place to begin amassing this confederation of Lamanite tribes, not to be confused with the Confederacy that formed in the South from the secession. Lucian Woodworth was sent on this mission to Texas to meet Sam Houston and to find a settlement place for the Mormons. There he met with the Karankawa and the Aranama people. Texas was largely controlled by the Numunu, the Comanche tribe, of course, a group who were vehemently opposed to European encroachment, and they were ready to war against their white oppressors. Lucian Woodworth made the Comanche chiefs in Texas an offer that they couldn't refuse. Join us, and we'll help you retain your lands and kill any paleface who tries to take your land. At this time, Buffalo Hump and Santa Anna had already formed an alliance with Sam Houston during the various skirmishes between Texans and Mexicans. So these Comanche chiefs weren't opposed to the idea of being in league with the new president if it served their ends. The Comanches also controlled the majority of the barren openness of Texas. If Texas was to be the new settling and the staging ground for the greatest army the nation of Zion had ever seen, Comanche cooperation was fundamentally crucial to Phase 3 of this plan. So both groups of natives were receptive to this new plan of, well, let's say it, President Smith, the Conqueror. The Potawatomi chiefs sent messengers to evangelize this new plan to tribes all across the wide open plains of the Midwest and all the way to the Rockies, all while the Comanches in Texas, with the help of Sam Houston, Lucian Woodworth, and Lyman White, set up camps and settlements in preparation for the surge of new Lamanites and freed descendants of Cain settlers flooding into the territory. Now, most Lamanite tribes were receptive to the proposal of the Potawatomi messengers. It was a matter of realism, right? Work with the new president, you can get your land back in 5 years' time. Don't work with the new president, well, your only option to delay the inevitable defeat is to run away and you're going to die tired, right? This was a situation where it was a choice between two terrible outcomes, one of which was slightly better. So, accordingly, the Iowa, the Missouri, the Osage, the Kansa, the Oto, the Pawnee, the Omaha, the Arikara, Mandan, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, a bunch of these Midwest tribes, by and large, they agreed to the plan without knowing further details. And even the various tribes who had relocated numerous times after the American government had repeatedly violated treaties, like, of course, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, and even much smaller groups like the Tawasa, the Wakoke, the Napache, the Moila, the Tunica, the Quaipaw, and the Osochi, those were also much more receptive to this new deal from President Smith. So any tribes who opposed this resettlement in Texas plan only put up minor opposition, and then they eventually agreed with very little persuasion. At least that's what our history books tell us. It's kind of hard to know the truth of what really happened here. Now, the catch with all of this scheming is that the overall plan of Phase 3 of this had to stay secret with the utmost prejudice. Only the Council of 50 could know that there was a plan once the north and south borders were secure, and this plan involved marching an army back to Washington, D.C. The grouping of Lamanites and descendants of Cain to Texas was largely viewed with positivity by the northern Union states because no New Englanders wanted to live in desert or in deseret territory for that matter. As expected, though, the Southern Confederacy hated the Zion Act, which only made them more opposed to northern tyranny. They and their succession would be dealt with in due time, once other matters were handled. So as vice president, Sidney Rigdon seemed to fall into the proper swing of politics rather quickly. His melancholia seemed to deteriorate with respect to how much distance was between him and President Smith. The further away they were from each other, the happier Rigdon was, and the more capable he was at accomplishing the demands of the office of acting president until Joseph succeeded in his military campaign. Brigham Young couldn't have been happier in any other place than he was waging war against the Confederates on the southern border. And to be clear, such a monumental task of maintaining the border between the Confederates and the Union, that was a task that was properly suited for a bean counter like Brigham Young. Under direction from the Council of 50, General Young established a complex system of communication and forts with watchtowers every 44 miles along the border. Even in areas which were strategically disadvantageous for the South to make an attack, Bloody Brigham was prepared with forts. He also established distilleries next to hospitals every 150 miles along the border. And nobody knows why, but at this time, Brigham Young was what we might call today a germaphobe. For whatever reason, he thought that soaking medical instruments in alcohol helped the doctors be more effective. And Brigham Young was onto something because it worked. Throughout the entire conflict on the northern and southern secession border, the Union lost somewhere in the ballpark of like 33,000 soldiers to the Confederacy's 250,000 soldiers. The number of people who were lost to opium addiction afterwards, that doesn't seem to be a statistic that was ever collected for whatever reason. Now, Lyman White was in Texas. That guy was crazy, and he super hated anyone who wasn't white. So Lyman White's time in Texas, quartering all of the Lamanites and the descendants of Cain, that was heaven for him. In the period of 4 years, Lyman White basically became the largest single entity driving slaves in all of Zion history. He had control over the everyday lives and living conditions of millions of people. None of them white, of course. And the exact numbers here were never collected because it doesn't matter that much, right? But it was millions of people. He was also successful at putting down the Mexican invasion into Texas, which was largely helped by this massive influx of freed slaves and Lamanites. And it's understandable because Lyman White was probably burning through 30,000 soldiers a month. Most of them didn't have armor or projectile weapons, so it's understandable that General White was able to maintain the line effectively. As for President Smith's military campaign across Deseret and establishing the expanding borders, we just don't know much about it. I had an anonymous source pass an account to me that was supposedly written by Daniel H. Wells, who was one of President Smith's major generals for the expansion border into the Deseret Territory. Daniel Wells was an interesting guy in Mormon history, and he was ranked 27th in the Council of 50 under President Smith, which is a very prestigious number. I don't have any way of corroborating whether or not this reminiscence actually came from him. In our world, it's hard to trust any information because it's so tightly controlled, but here it is anyway. April 1st, 1845. General Smith made some few remarks on the mission of our formidable legion. We embarked upon our journey into the land of the Lamanites. April 20th, 1845. First contact with Lamanite tribe called Kanza, no fight. May 5th, 1845. Used up Kanza and Odo Lamanites, some dead, no Nauvoo Legion casualties. May 29th, 1845. Hot out and no rain for weeks. Found Pawnee Lamanites, removed to Texas without resistance. June 27th, 1845. Crow Lamanites, ferocious. Most fight to death. Some without arms from cannonballs continue to assault. Many Legion casualties. July 4th, 1845. Used up crows. Prairies filled with slain. Blood running through creek to fill Crow Pond. General Smith ordered a count of slain Lamanites by cutting off tips of noses. Counted 1,233 from this day's battle. Legion casualties number in scores. August 15th, 1845. Sioux, formidable warriors. Many have guns. General Smith prophesied cannon fire will take the day. Prophecy true. Many body parts without bodies all over village. Little provisions obtained. Village burned. Left dead for wolves. November 2nd, 1845. Established winter encampment at East Rocky Mountains, near friendly Ute Lamanites. They are kind and agreed to remove to Texas peaceably. Warn of Shoshone warrior Wakara. March 15th, 1846. Set out from winter camp, Utes en route to Texas. Found Arapaho settlements and left none alive. Salted ground, left arsenic in wells. March 30th, 1846. Moved north toward Cheyenne Lamanites. Some fight, others lie down and ask to be slain like anti-Nephi Lehite ancestors. Refuse to remove to Texas, none left alive. So many bodies, doubtless will cause trouble to animals in vicinity. June 1st, 1846. Finished crossing Rocky Mountains to Salt Lake. General Smith met Chief Wakara to negotiate Shoshone surrender. Wakara refused. Smith brandished Bowie knife. Wakara cried out to his warriors. Smith cut him across chest. Insides fell out. Smith used him up by cutting throat. Warriors terrified and ran. Tracked for hours before finding their village hideout. Used up village, none left alive. Buildings burned. Their crops harvested and bison killed for Nauvoo Legion. Why can Lamanites not understand the will of God and remove peaceably to Texas? July 9th, 1846. Arrived to Navajo settlements. Good Lamanites, truly beloved by God of Abraham, agreed to peaceable removal to Texas. Their Lamanite brethren would do well to do the same. July 24th, 1846. Found peaceable go shoot. Most agreed to removal with little bloodshed. Why must they require us to shed blood before agreeing for removal? September 9th, 1846. Continue west to Numa Paiute. All opposed, all dead. May God have mercy on their cursed souls. October 10th, 1846. Began winter settlement on edge of California. Intel from northern contingents good. Expect Piegan, Blackfoot, Kootenai, Assiniboine, Nez Perce, and Palouse removal coming spring. December 21st, 1846. Cold, snow, many hungry. Slaughtering extra horses to feed army. Spirit of melancholia everywhere. Dreams, bad. Crying of Lamanites heard everywhere, even in sleep. December 24th, 1846. Better today. Cold. Spirit of rejoicing throughout camp when supply wagons arrived. We shall feast for Christmas. Truly we are the Lord's chosen army and people, for his blessings are aplenty. March 1st, 1847. Begin California. Many Lamanite tribes to remove. September 8th, 1847. California campaign success. Tribes removed. Yahi, Wintu, Slokiang, Wiat, Batawat, Huankaut, Chasta, Hupa, Nangatul, Wailiki, Patwin, Pomo, Huchanam, Nishinam, Wishoa, Mutsitil, Mayakama, Miwuk, Maidu. Tribes used up. Too many to enumerate. So many dead. So much blood. Ocean beautiful. November 10th, 1847. Digueno Lamanites resist. Much cannon shot used. Rent bodies to pieces. General Smith is gifted with cannon in command. Arrows no match. Why can Lamanites not be of good cheer and belief in modern-day Moses? God is with us. God destroys all who oppose his will and people. Screams of terror louder, even when no bloodshed about or asleep. November 11th, 1847. General Smith rewards our valiant fight with pleasant winter quarters near ocean, temperate clime, and beautiful scenery. No bodies here. February 13th, 1848. Begin march to Texas. Plan to rally with General Lyman White for Phase 3. March 10th, 1848. Apache, terrifying. So much resistance. March 13th, 1848. Siege of Apache settlement. They fight hard. March 15th, 1848. Apache refused to surrender. March 16th, 1848. Siege continues. Villages starving. Women and children wail through the night, even while I sleep. March 17th, 1848. Screaming never ceases. How long will they oppose the will of God? March 19th, 1848. Apache refused to remove to Texas. Cannons loosed. Horrible bloodshed. March 20th, 1848. Apache surrender. General Smith refuses to accept surrender. Commands slaughter. Some soldiers refused and were used up on the spot. All Apache dead. Nobody left alive to scream, but still hear screams. Took provisions for Nauvoo Legion. Piled bodies in center of village. All burned. No further battle could be more bloody. Asked General Smith if we should count dead Lamanites. He turned to me and asked, why? With no thought or feeling. Suspect more than 10,000 dead. June 2nd, 1848. Time running short for election. Phase 3 must be completed. General Smith ordered no more diplomacy until rendezvous with General White. All Lamanites to be used up and burned till we reach Texas. July 4th, 1848. Reached General White. Generals embraced with tears and joy. Yavapi, Maricopa, Kokpa, Pima, and Hopi, all used up on Germany. In safety with no more bloodshed, but the screaming never ceases. May originate from within, should see physician. July 9th, 1848. Phase 3 began. And that's all from Daniel Wells. Like I said, true information is hard to come by. Real documents, this was just passed to me from a trusted source. I don't know whether it's real or not. The Deseret Territory campaign under President Smith's command was apparently a resounding success. This left the country divided into 3 distinct and separate territories: the Northern Union States, the Southern Confederacy, and the Territory of Deseret. The campaign was successful, but the war was far from over. The campaign had run the expected 3.5 years since it kicked off from the headquarters of Nauvoo, but 1848 brought another election year, and a hotly contested one at that. President Smith refused to give up the office of president and the disunited states and territories, so he put the final phase of his plan into play. There were enough remaining Lamanites after the Deseret campaign that were still willing to fight. They'd been promised that when Joseph Smith took office that they'd retake their lands from the Palefaces. Now, President Smith was never known for keeping promises, but if he could travel alongside somebody to a similar desired location, he would use them up until they no longer had anything to offer him. So accordingly, President Smith began Phase 3, Conflagration, which meant marching hundreds of thousands of Lamanites and free descendants of Cain from their stronghold in Texas to Washington, D.C. Why? Why do this? Well, as president, Joseph made too many controversial calls and risked political capital that he didn't have. His administration was fraught with scandal and controversy for the entire 4 years, especially the sex trafficking stuff, and there's no way that he would get more than 30% of the popular vote. I wish I could tell you more about all of the scandals, but all of those documents and newspapers were destroyed. What I'm trying to say is, the only way that Joseph could retain his seat as president was by forcing it through superior military power. Nobody in the country had an army that could rival the Nauvoo Legion with its hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not even to the tune of 10% of its size. And the warriors themselves? I mean, think about them. The Lamanites and the descendants of Cain were fighting for ideological reasons to take back their homelands and wreak vengeance upon their white oppressors. You simply can't pay a soldier enough to make up for the ferocity these legionnaires fought with. It's why the Deseret campaign was so successful, even though most of it was fought Lamanites against Lamanites. They were fighting for ideologies. General Smith had hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were motivated by vengeance and bloodlust. No weapon in existence at that time could combat this force of nature. Today, well, of course, the council has ways of ensuring compliance, but back then, nothing could fight this. Phase 3, the journey back across the Eastern Plains states through the Northern Territory, was swift and met with absolutely no opposition. People knew the Deseret campaign was successful, and they cowered in fear from General Smith's army. The Nauvoo Legion occupied towns and drained them of resources all the way from the Mississippi to Washington, D.C., a journey of over 1,000 miles undertaken by hundreds of thousands of soldiers with General Smith at their head. But this wasn't a direct march because the Southern Confederacy was still an issue to be dealt with. But Joseph was smart in how he handled the Southern insurrection. While Brigham Young's detachment maintained the border between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy, General Smith's main army never set foot inside any of the Confederacy states. You see, President Smith didn't want to invade the Confederacy, as that would only lead to more senseless bloodshed. Instead, he decided to rest on the laurels of his decided military victory in the Deseret campaign, and all that he wanted was for the Confederacy to peaceably realize complete and total defeat should they oppose the new Order of Zion and Maronite law. So what Joseph did instead was brilliant. He sent small messenger parties exclusively of Lamanite warriors, never more than 7 men per group, to simply carry a decree to each and every city in the Confederacy. The decree just needed to be signed by the mayor of each town for it to be valid. What did the decree do? It was basically a surrender order. Don't oppose the new order of Zionism, and you can continue to go about your life as you see fit. The decree established the Southern Confederacy, the Northern Union, and the Deseret Territory as three separate sovereign city-states that operated under a common umbrella theocratic government known as Zion, the Kingdom of God. Now, Deseret Territory in 1848 and all the way into the late 1860s was already being settled by white people from all over the nation since the Army's campaign into the Deseret Territory began. The settlers even included refugees from the South who didn't want to be part of the Confederacy. This decree also reestablished borders so that everything east of the Mississippi that was divided as Union and Confederate, that's how they remained, depending on what side of the Mason-Dixon line you were on, right? So that remained as the Northern Territory and the Southern Territory. And everything, I mean everything west of the Mississippi, became part of the Deseret Territory. These three territories answered only to the Council of 50 and the PPKR of the council. To this day, the prophet, priest, king, and ruler of the council, ever since the death of President Smith, has been a descendant of the original council formed in March 1844 in Nauvoo. When the Nauvoo Legion arrived in Washington, D.C., their reputation had preceded them, and the city was nearly empty. The Legion had burned or sucked dry the resources of every single city on their march from Nauvoo to D.C. Word spread long before the armies got there that if there would be no opposition in D.C., then there needn't be any bloodshed. The history books say that this march encountered absolutely no opposition, and not a single person was violently killed during the march back. But that's what the history book says. I mean, who knows, really? There's no way to know for sure. Joseph and the Nauvoo Legion arrived in D.C. in October of 1848 for the president to finally take the Oval Office for the first time in his entire presidency. Something that's interesting here is there must have been hard feelings about how Vice President Rigdon ran the Union while President Joseph was on the Deseret campaign, because Vice President Rigdon seems to disappear from the historical record too. There's a story about what happened between the two of them. It's probably apocryphal, but it's still an interesting story. So according to legend, Joseph had a ring on his finger when he finally greeted Rigdon for the first time in nearly 4 years since inauguration. Because, well, I mean, President Smith was so occupied with being the military commander on the front lines of the expanding Deseret campaign into the territory. So when these two men saw each other, it was a tearful reunion between these two longtime friends who had been through so much together. Apparently, President Smith heard that Rigdon was about to go public with some manuscript that the anti-Mormons talked about a lot in the 1830s, and I don't know the details of it, but Joseph didn't want that information to get out. Supposedly it had something to do with the Book of Mormon, but like I said, this is all legend, so take this all with a grain of salt. But when President Smith learned this information, that Rigdon was about to betray him, he was careful to conceal his knowledge of that information from Rigdon. So they called a meeting of the Council of 50. This was the first official convention of the Council of 50 since the military campaigns had begun 4 years before. During the opening ceremonies, President Smith greeted Vice President Rigdon through the veil by giving him the sure sign of the nail. But instead of replying that this is the sure sign of the nail, Joseph whispered in Rigdon's ear, "This is the sure sign of your penalty." Rigdon recoiled instantly as he felt a small tingle where Joseph shook his hand. He looked down and noticed a small drop of blood coming from his wrist. Horrified, Rigdon asked, "What is this? What have you done?" And President Smith's reply to this enemy of Zion was coyly said through a smile, "It is the kiss of the devil, for he has power over you." Apparently, President Smith had learned from one of the Lamanite doctors about Datura inoxia, the devil's weed. Those who live by the devil's weed die by it. Rigdon instantly went into fits of convulsions, his limbs paralyzed into rigidity, and a dreadful look of unimaginable fear froze on his face as his soul slipped away into spirit prison. Legend has it that he was too disfigured from this death for them to even do a death mask of the guy. That every time they tried to put a death mask on him, you could see the pain and fear in the mask, no matter what they did. I don't know, right? This is just a cool story. It wouldn't surprise me if it's true, but that's because nothing surprises me anymore. But as far as I can tell, it's just a legend. President Smith, when he returned after this meeting with Vice President Rigdon, when he got to Washington, D.C., President Smith outlawed the Electoral College. He collected and burned every copy of the American Constitution. He wrote his own Constitution, and he remained PPKR of the Council of 50 and Zion until his death on September 11th, 1857, at the age of 51. Heart attack. That's what got him. I know, right? Kind of surprising. He was a guy under a lot of stress. He lived a hard and fast life. But the point is, his mission here was complete. He established Zion. How we got to where we are today, that's mostly thanks to Joseph Smith and his successor, PPKR Young. Brigham Young's Council of 50 conquered British and French forces for the Canadian Conquest campaign. Russia was actually really helpful in that whole ordeal. They had these crazy, rickety old submarines, and the British Navy had absolutely no answer for the submarines. So PPKR Young also annexed Mexico into the territory of Deseret, although the people there don't usually call themselves Celestials. They instead prefer their native Mexican label to keep some semblance of their erased heritage. President Young's military history is dark, and we just don't know a lot about it. None of our history books talk about it, but legend has Brigham's army slaughtering entire villages with contraptions that threw flames hundreds of feet through the air without even offering the people a surrender treaty. Then, any prisoners that they took were decimated, killing 1 in every 10 in order to instill absolute fear into the minds of the survivors. Then those survivors were often sold into slavery. Now, one story was told of PPKR Brigham Young's troops after the Blackfoot battles, and this is truly disturbing. President Young's troops, after the Blackfoot battles, took the prisoners of war and forced them to construct their own prison camps. The walls, however, weren't brick. The walls were made of the dead Blackfoot Lamanites, and the prisoners had to sit in an open field surrounded by a wall of rotting corpses that they built until they all thirsted to death days later. Some legends say that they tried to drink the blood of their kin to satisfy their thirst, but just died anyway. PPKR Young's 20 years as president of Zion, they were a bad time to live in this country. But he gave us a lot of what we have today. He turned the territories into 3 stakes instead of territories, each with their, a different number of states. We, here in Deseret Stake, they call us Celestians. Those in the northern stake, on the east side, those are known as the Terrestrians, while those in the south stake are known as the Telestians. And those terms, they're sometimes pejorative terms, but they kind of fit with what our respective societies look like, if I'm going to be honest. The old state of Missouri, that's a standalone piece of land inside Zion. We call Missouri, what used to be Missouri, outer darkness. President Smith had a vendetta against the state of Missouri. In 1848, after General Smith took the White House and refused to step down as president, and the Council of 50 formed the Constitution of the Kingdom of God, aka the Constitution of Zion, President Smith took a contingent of soldiers to Missouri and surrounded the state on all sides. Nobody knows what happened after that, but I understand that to this day, nearly 2 centuries later, most of the state is still uninhabitable. What land is habitable is where the prisoners go, and we don't hear anything about them. I really don't know why Missouri is outer darkness, because Christ is supposed to return there and the keys will be restored there, but it's just darkness. Nobody really knows what happens there. At least they don't tell any of us. As for me, I try to lay as low as I can. It's hard to trust anything you hear nowadays, and I'm not even sure I believe in the church anymore, but it doesn't really matter. The Nauvoo Legion are scary. I just try to get by with my life. How do I do that? I just live like everybody else. I love my families, I work hard, and I keep my mouth shut. When the council finds out somebody doesn't believe, there's no place for apostates in Deseret Nation. I don't want somebody to accuse me of having a mind of outer darkness. I wouldn't survive for 1 minute in Missouri. I grew up in Bountiful, in the state of Salt Lake and Deseret Stake. Bountiful is basically a suburb of Zarahemla, which is where the church is headquartered. It was nice there. It was nice to grow up close to the capital of Deseret. Our family only had 3 slaves, and all of my parents were very goodly. My family was relatively small, but our next door neighbors, they had like 4 houses for all of their kids. It was crazy. Eventually, I moved to Seattle in Oregon State. I'm still in Deseret Stake. I'm still a Celestian, and it's really nice here. Although, the population really seems to be growing at an unsustainable rate. We are one of the few places in all of Zion with solar power and water desalination, so we're going to be fine as the last of the permafrost melts away in a few years. The taxes are really high, but we're told that the United Order only takes in what it needs to operate, not an ante and more, and I have no reason to distrust them. The elections here, they're unanimous, which seems kind of strange. The only real fear that we live with here is Russian expansion. Since the Arctic cap melted, I hear that the fighting up in what used to be the Canadian territories, now in Deseret, I hear the fighting is really bad. It's really crazy, but I don't know much about it. We don't know much. They try to keep as little information coming to us as possible. I did read a headline yesterday, and I thought this was really cool. Apparently, scientists have finally been able to achieve a 25-75% male to female ratio in the population of Zion. It's amazing. I couldn't believe it. It's good because President Young abolished child marriage laws, so female children in the womb right now are sealed to their husbands before they even come into the world and are birthed. So hopefully the female population will continue to grow to reduce this practice because getting sealed to fetuses just seems really weird to me. Luckily, slavery isn't practiced here all that much, but in the terrestrial and telestial stakes, I hear it's really, really horrible there. Although, I don't know, up here in Celestia, we don't get much information about the other stakes, and traveling to them is only possible for the exceptionally wealthy. I often wonder about how things might be different. If this didn't happen or that event hadn't occurred in history or something was different, how would that change the world that we live in today? Could Zion ever survive as a secular nation like the Founding Fathers envisioned when they created the United States of America? What would a country with the original Constitution look like if it hadn't been replaced with Maronite law? What if the Council of 50 was never formed to begin with on that fateful day in March of 1844? What if slavery were outlawed again, or God lifted the curse from the seed of Cain? What's it like in countries where kids grow up with only 2 parents? I bet it's really weird. I'm told these other countries are devolving into hell because they don't have new and everlasting families, and they drink alcohol and do drugs like tobacco and stuff. But I don't know. I guess I just think a lot, and it's probably not good for me in Zion. But when I'm lying in one of my beds at night, just staring at the ceiling, I can't help but wonder, what if everything were different?
The worst thing that happens to the human mind is belief. The human brain, that when we're given to this world, it is taught to analyze our environment, analyze our atmosphere, analyze our planet. We are taught to count, to weigh, and to measure. And then we can surmise what things are and what things aren't. But once you begin introducing belief to an individual, it literally corrupts the hard drive of the mind. It's a corruption factor. So that depending on what you've learned and believed, you start saying, 1 + 1 doesn't actually mean 2, It could mean 3. It depends on how you see it.
There's no God, little one. He's the reason to scare the pain away from those who should choose to fucking pray.
He gave his life.
You say
he'll save your life today.
Why can't you just admit right here that the gun to your head is what you really think? Never stop believing because of you. Lost my faith in something and follow through. There's no love, selfish one. Is it easy for you to live a lie while others submit and slowly die?
It's all a choice.
Scream.
We have no voice.
Someone has left a crazy here with blood on her hands. You fucking crocodile! Never stop believing because of you. Lost my faith
This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.